GDP growth is slowing in the north. Let's have a look. Hello everyone, Heise here, and welcome to another episode of Heise Says. Still working through my morning stein of coffee, and I thought for our second episode today we would have a look at this article sent to me by a viewer. And it's framed as Melbourne is closing on Sydney as the nation's economic powerhouse. Now it sounds like good news. Melbourne's growing. But the cynical side of me, I always have to ruin it for someone, is we look at our GDP growth, and it has been, well, let's just say, not in a stellar way the last few periods. So the last quarter measure growth was trending down. So we're still growing. We are still growing, but that growth is slowing. So before we go through this article, let's just jump over here and have a look at this is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Australian National Accounts. And we have the September quarter. So Australia's domestic final demand increased 0.2%. Public spending was the largest contributor to growth. So public spending is the largest contributor to growth. Now, a big portion of that, we can see that here in this wage growth data, showing the disparity between the private sector and the public sector growth. You can see that in the red and purple lines below. Purple is private, red is the public sector. It's been growing higher. A big chunk of the wage growth came from Victoria in the public sector. So just remember that when we read this article as well, saying that Melbourne's shooting up, Melbourne's growing. Because, well, we can see from the national accounts here, public spending was a large contributor to the growth. And Victoria, I've done that in a different previous video, a big chunk of that was from public sector, the health sector. So, as government final consumption expenditure increased by 0.9 and public gross fixed capital formation increased 1.9. Household final consumption expenditure rose 0.1. Private gross fixed capital expenditure detracted from growth, with falls in machinery and equipment, negative 4.2, and dwelling investment, negative 1.7. So those of us in the private sector, guys, we're not pulling out weight. We're not investing in our businesses or, dwelling investment. The government has to step up and give those civil servants more money. But we can see here the state final demand. Okay? You can see here, Northern Territory, down, Queensland, low, New South Wales only at 0.3. So this gives us just a good little representation of where it's sitting. Now we'll jump back here to this article, and with that based in mind, with the understanding of public spending growth and GDP growth, let's have a look at this, because I think they're framing it in a particular way. Melbourne is driving national economic growth on the back of burgeoning finance, construction and health services. With forecasts it will challenge Sydney as the Australian economy's most important city. Or could this just be saying that Sydney is declining? A report to be released on Monday also shows the drought is taking a huge economic toll on parts of Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, widening the gap between them and urban Australia as Sydney and Melbourne draw away from rural areas and regional centres. SGS Economics and Planning found that during the 2018-2019, the Melbourne economy alone accounted for 40% of Australia's total growth. Melbourne gross domestic product reached $369 billion, compared with regional Victoria's $76 billion. Just look at that comparison there, guys. These cities produce a lot. 40% of Australia's total growth. And I'll bring up a quote from Matt Berry, from his House of Cards. Back in 2016, essentially 67% of Australia's GDP growth came from Sydney and Melbourne, and 24% of the entire country's growth came from an area between Sydney CBD and Macquarie Park in just apartment building. I'll leave this here if you want to read through the whole thing, but I strongly recommend, if you have not read his article, because it's a few years old, but it still is quite concerning. What does that tell you here? And we're looking at, property prices around Melbourne. So it's like this wealth is concentrated, this growth is concentrated right in the cities, which is nothing really new. Australia's GDP expanded by 1.9%, but Melbourne's own GDP lifted by 4%. Sydney's GDP at $461 billion grew by 2.6%, its lowest since 2012-13, to account for a third of national growth. Adelaide's GDP, though much smaller than Sydney, grew substantially faster, while Brisbane's GDP lifted by 2.6%. Perth continued 5 years of no growth. SGS Economics National Leader of Economics and Social Analysis, Terry Rawnsley, said Melbourne's economic structure had dramatically changed over recent decades, giving it a depth and breadth that was helping it grow. So if we have a look here, Melbourne's still growing, Adelaide a tiny bit, but you can't compare Adelaide, Tasmania and Canberra to Sydney or Melbourne, even Brisbane. Look at regional growth, or regional Victoria. Look at regional Queensland and regional South Australia. Is there even a regional South Australia anymore? Northern Territory. So there is a huge disparity in growth. Even with the closure of the car manufacturing sector, the growth over the past 4 years in Melbourne GDP has been the strongest we have seen for 15 to 20 years, he said. There was a broad-based growth across Melbourne, with healthcare and professional services the largest contributor. Okay, public spending. Big chunk of that is public spending. One of the reasons for Melbourne's strong growth has been a substantial change in its economy. In 1999, more than 14% of Melbourne's GDP was attributed to the manufacturing sector. That has collapsed to just 6%. Yes, so Melbourne's manufacturing has just been cut in half, more than cut in half. In its place, the financial sector is now the city's most important, followed by professional services, construction, and healthcare. Sydney's manufacturing sector accounted for almost 5% of the city's GDP, half what it did 2 decades ago. Its dependency on the financial sector has grown to a nationwide high of 14%. Professional services, construction, and healthcare are also key parts of Sydney's economy. The economic profiles of Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane have become more similar over the past 20 years. Adelaide and Tasmania both rely more heavily on healthcare, a sign that the average age of both are higher than other parts of the country, while Perth is more dependent on construction than other parts of the country. The report follows a separate analysis by British-based Oxford Economics, which predicts Melbourne will continue to grow in financial importance, while Sydney will ebb. Like SGS, it found that the Melbourne economy had, over the past 2 decades, outperformed the Sydney economy. And we can see here's Melbourne in the light blue, and we can see Sydney. And this is the predictions. So they're still saying Sydney will be bigger than Melbourne. Look at that climb there. Quick guys, hurry, get your Sydney property now. So the average annual growth. Are they just pulling forward what they're predicting? What is driving this spike? What is driving this spike? And these are 2015 prices. It's interesting. I like to see the report. So the top 100 cities, how they change. So Melbourne in 2019 is ranked 40th, Sydney 29, and by 35, Melbourne will go up 5 and Sydney down 2. Oxford Economics said Melbourne was gaining on Sydney in part because it had shed its old provincial reputation. In Sydney, there's recently been significant investment in transport infrastructure, but higher costs and ever greater congestion levels have enabled Melbourne to catch up in economic terms. Amid the Victorian capital's transition from being historically the more provincial city to a more dynamic and hip urban centre to rival Sydney, it found. Melbourne is expected to retain its edge over Sydney, affecting their global ranking. Sydney, currently the 29th largest city economically in the world, is expected to edge down to 31st by 2035, overtaking Kunjundu in China and Miami Fort Lauderdale in the United States. Melbourne is expected to rise 5 positions to be the 35th largest city economy. Despite recent tough years in the wake of the end of the mining construction boom, Perth is forecast to climb 13 places to 67 in the world, while Brisbane will break into the world's top 100 for the first time. Perth is ahead of Brisbane. Oxford Economics said New York, Tokyo, Los Angeles, London, and Paris are the world's largest cities by GDP. By 2035, it is expected all but Paris will remain in the top 5, with Shanghai taking the French capital's position. Beijing, Kaohsiung, and Shenzhen are tipped to enter the top 10, supplanting centers including Chicago, Dallas, and Osaka, Kyoto. What do you think, guys? What do you think? Optimistic projections? What if growth doesn't continue? But another little takeaway from this is that in both these cities, in Sydney and Melbourne, guys, in both of these cities, a large proportion now of their GDP for the city is dependent on the financial sector compared to manufacturing. Now, if we have a sputtering in the financial sector, maybe the trade deal to the perpetual trade negotiation or perpetual trade war that's going to keep on going and going and going continues, or something happens on a global scale that might cause some issues, or maybe our arrears rates start climbing higher and the financial sector starts to splutter. What do you think will happen to these two cities? Let me know what you think in the comments, guys. If you're a fan of the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. If you want to help us produce more content, we have a Patreon where you can make a monthly donation. We also have affiliate links with Amazon and eBay where we receive a small commission every time you make a purchase. We've got a relationship referral link with Independent Reserve if you're buying crypto. And finally, we have merch on the Heise Says website. Thank you to everyone who helps support Heise Says. We really appreciate it. Take care, and I will talk to you later. Bye for now.